6 young women knelt in the dirt outside Thaddeus Bell's ranch, their faces streaked with tears and dust. But the man they begged for help hadn't spoken to another soul in 3 years. And what they were about to ask him would force him to choose between his carefully guarded solitude and something far more dangerous than loneliness. The sun beat down mercilessly on the remote valley where Thaddeus had built his fortress of silence. His weathered hands gripped the porch railing as he stared at the impossible sight before him. 6 figures in torn dresses, kneeling like broken dolls against the backdrop of his endless fence line. The youngest couldn't have been more than 17. The oldest maybe 25. His throat felt like sandpaper. 3 years since he'd heard a human voice that wasn't his own, echoing back from the canyon walls. 3 years since he'd deliberately chosen this existence, cutting every tie that bound him to the world beyond his property line. The nearest town was a 2-day ride through treacherous terrain. No one came here by accident, yet here they were. The one with auburn hair raised her head first. Her green eyes held a desperation he recognized, though he'd spent years trying to forget that look. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a whispered croak emerged. Her lips were cracked, her face hollow with exhaustion. Whatever had brought them here, they'd traveled far and suffered much. Thaddeus felt his carefully constructed walls begin to tremble. Every instinct screamed at him to turn away, to retreat into his cabin and pretend this moment never happened. He'd learned the hard way that helping others only led to pain, that trust was a luxury he could no longer afford, that the safest place was alone, always alone. But as the auburn-haired woman struggled to stand, swaying dangerously, something stirred in his chest. A feeling he'd buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it was dead. The feeling that maybe, just maybe, running away wasn't the same as being safe. The woman took a step forward, her voice barely audible across the distance between them. Her words would shatter the silence he'd built around himself like armor. And once spoken, there would be no taking them back, because what she was about to tell him would reveal that his 3 years of isolation had been nothing compared to the choice he was about to face. The auburn-haired woman's voice cracked as she spoke, but her words cut through the desert air like a blade. "Please, mister, we ain't got nowhere else to go. They're hunting us." Thaddeus gripped the porch railing tighter, his knuckles white against the sun-bleached wood. Hunting. The word triggered memories he'd spent years suppressing. Images of another woman, another desperate plea, another moment when he'd made the wrong choice. His jaw clenched so hard it ached. "You need to leave," he called back, his voice rusty from disuse. "I can't help you." But even as the words left his mouth, he noticed details that made his stomach twist with dread. The woman's dress wasn't just torn, it was shredded in places that suggested violence. Dark stains marked the fabric, some that looked suspiciously like dried blood. The other 5 women bore similar signs of rough treatment. Whatever they were running from, it had already caught up to them once. The woman stumbled forward another step, her hand pressed to her side. When she pulled it away, Thaddeus saw fresh blood seeping through her fingers. His breath caught in his throat. She was wounded, maybe badly. They all looked half dead from exhaustion and dehydration. "They took our wagon 3 days back," she continued, her voice growing weaker. "Killed our guide. Said they'd do worse if they caught us again. You're our last hope, mister. The only soul between here and the border." Border. The word hit Thaddeus like a physical blow. These weren't just travelers in distress. They were fugitives. Whatever trouble they carried with them would become his trouble the moment he offered them shelter. He'd learned that lesson once before, and it had cost him everything that mattered. But as he watched the woman sway on her feet, her face growing paler by the second, something inside him cracked. She was going to collapse. They all were. And if he sent them away now, he'd be signing their death warrants just as surely as if he'd pulled a trigger himself. The woman's legs buckled. She fell to her knees in the dirt, her blood now visible as a growing stain in the dust beneath her. The other women rushed to her side, their own weakness forgotten in their desperation to help their leader. Thaddeus found himself walking down the porch steps before his mind could catch up to his body. 3 years of isolation had taught him many things, but it hadn't killed the part of him that couldn't watch another human being suffer, not when he had the power to prevent it. But as he approached the group of women, a new sound reached his ears. Hoofbeats, distant but growing closer. Multiple horses, moving fast across the hard-pan desert floor. Someone was coming and they were riding hard. The auburn-haired woman heard it too. Terror flashed across her face as she grabbed Thaddeus's arm with blood-slicked fingers. "They found us," she whispered. "Dear God, they found us." Thaddeus looked toward the horizon where a cloud of dust was rising in the distance. Whoever was coming would be here within the hour, and when they arrived, they'd find 6 women who were clearly running from something, and 1 man who was about to discover that some choices can't be undone. Thaddeus's mind raced as he calculated distances and options. The approaching riders would reach his ranch in less than an hour. 6 wounded women couldn't outrun mounted men, especially not in their current condition. But helping them meant destroying the sanctuary he'd built from 3 years of careful isolation. "Get them inside," he heard himself say, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. Now, the auburn-haired woman, who introduced herself weakly as Clara, tried to protest. "We won't bring trouble to your door, mister. We can hide in the rocks." "You'll die in the rocks," Thaddeus replied bluntly. He was already moving, his survival instincts overriding 3 years of self-imposed hermitage. "And those riders will find your bodies come morning. Then they'll know someone helped you." He gathered the weakest woman, a blonde barely out of girlhood who seemed to be burning with fever, into his arms. Her weight shocked him. She was nothing but skin and bones, lighter than a feed sack. When had he last held another human being? The memory felt like touching a flame. The other women supported each other as they stumbled toward his cabin. Thaddeus noticed details that made his jaw clench with anger. Rope burns on their wrists, bruises in the shape of fingers around their throats. These weren't just fugitives, they were victims. Inside the one-room cabin that had been his entire world for 3 years, the women collapsed onto whatever surfaces they could find. The contrast was jarring. His space, which had felt appropriately sparse for a man who wanted nothing from the world, now seemed painfully small and inadequate for 6 desperate souls. Clara pressed her hand harder against her wounded side as she looked around the cabin. Her eyes took in the single bed, the minimal furniture, the complete absence of anything that suggested a woman had ever lived here. "You're alone," she said, and it wasn't a question. "By choice," Thaddeus replied, already moving to barricade the windows. "And you're about to find out why." Through the gaps in the wooden shutters, he could see the dust cloud growing larger. The riders were pushing hard, which meant they were either desperate to catch their quarry or confident they were close. Neither possibility boded well. "Who are they?" he asked Clara as he checked his rifle. The weapon felt strange in his hands after so long, but muscle memory was returning. Clara's face went pale. "Slavers," she whispered. "They bought us from a man who promised us work in the territories, said we'd be teachers and seamstresses. Instead," she gestured to her torn dress, her bruised throat. Thaddeus felt ice form in his veins. Slavers, the worst kind of predator, the kind that saw human beings as livestock to be bought and sold, the kind that would kill anyone who stood between them and their property. The hoofbeats were close enough now that he could distinguish individual horses. At least 6 riders, maybe more. Professional men who wouldn't be deterred by a single rancher's defiance. As Clara struggled to stand, her face twisted with pain and determination, she said something that made Thaddeus's blood run cold. "There's something else you need to know. Something that makes this worse than you think." Clara's next words hit Thaddeus like a physical blow. "The man who sold us to the slavers, he's a federal marshal, badge and everything, name of Wade Garrett." The rifle nearly slipped from Thaddeus's hands. A federal marshal. That changed everything. These weren't just lawless raiders he could drive off with superior firepower. If a man with a badge was involved, it meant the corruption ran deep, all the way up to territorial authority. "That's why we can't go to the law," Clara continued, her voice growing weaker as blood continued to seep between her fingers. "Garrett's got connections in 3 territories. Anyone we report to, he'll hear about it first. Then we disappear permanent-like." Through the window, Thaddeus could now make out individual riders cresting the ridge that overlooked his valley. 6 men on horseback, moving with the confidence of hunters who'd cornered their prey. One of them wore something that glinted in the sunlight, a badge. Thaddeus felt the familiar weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. Help these women and become a target himself, turn them away and watch them die. Either path led to consequences he wasn't sure he could live with. "There's a root cellar," he said finally, his voice rough with decision. "Behind the cabin under a false floor. It's where I store supplies for winter. You can hide there." But Clara shook her head. "They'll search everywhere. These men, they're thorough. They've been tracking us for days and they know their business." The youngest woman, the one with fever, suddenly spoke for the first time. Her voice was barely a whisper, but her words cut through the tension like a knife. He's right to be scared. We bring death wherever we go. Thaddeus looked at her more closely and felt his heart skip. She couldn't be more than 16, with corn-silk hair and blue eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. What kind of monsters sold children? The hoofbeats were close enough now that he could hear leather creaking, men calling to each other in low voices. They were spreading out, surrounding the ranch with military precision. Professional kidnappers who'd done this many times before. "Listen to me," Thaddeus said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "I need to know exactly what we're dealing with. How many men? What weapons? How far will they go?" Clara met his eyes, and he saw a depth of suffering that made his own 3 years of self-imposed exile seem like a vacation. "They'll burn this place to the ground if they have to. Kill anyone who stands in their way. These ain't men with consciences, mister. They're devils in human skin." Through the shutter slats, Thaddeus caught his first clear glimpse of the lead rider. The man sat his horse like he owned the world, his badge catching the light as he surveyed the ranch buildings. Even at a distance, Thaddeus could see the cold calculation in his posture. This was Wade Garrett, the federal marshal who sold human beings for profit. If you were Thaddeus, what would you do? Stand and fight against impossible odds knowing you'd likely die but might save 6 innocent lives? Or find a way to negotiate? Potentially saving yourself but possibly dooming the women to a fate worse than death? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose. Because what Thaddeus decided next would determine whether anyone in that cabin would live to see another sunrise. The riders had stopped just outside rifle range, close enough to communicate but far enough to avoid immediate danger. Garrett raised his voice, and his words carried clearly across the desert air. "Afternoon, friend. We're looking for some runaway property. 6 women who stole themselves from their rightful owners. You seen anyone like that around here?" Thaddeus stepped onto his porch, rifle held loosely in his hands but ready. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard as he faced down 6 mounted men who radiated menace like heat from a forge. Marshal Garrett sat his horse in the center, his badge gleaming against a black vest that had seen too much blood. "Haven't seen anybody," Thaddeus called back, his voice carrying the flat tone of a man accustomed to solitude. "Don't get many visitors out here." Garrett's smile was cold as winter stone. "That's so. Mind if we take a look around? Sometimes folks hide in places they think nobody'll find them." Behind Thaddeus, inside the cabin, he could hear the faint sounds of the women trying to muffle their breathing. Clara had grown silent, probably unconscious from blood loss. The youngest was still burning with fever. None of them were in any condition to run, even if there was somewhere to go. "This is private property," Thaddeus replied, "and I don't recall inviting you to search it." One of Garrett's men, a scarred brute with dead eyes, spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Federal authority trumps private property, hermit. You got something to hide or you just naturally unfriendly?" Thaddeus felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the desert heat. These men weren't here to negotiate. They'd already decided he was hiding something. The only question was how far they'd go to prove it. "Funny thing about hermits," Garrett said, dismounting with fluid grace. "They usually choose isolation because they got secrets. What's your secret, friend?" The marshal took a step closer, his hand resting casually on his pistol grip. "See, we've been tracking those women for 3 days. Lost their trail about a mile from here, right where the hard ground starts. Now I'm thinking a smart man might have helped them cover their tracks. Question is, why would he do that?" Thaddeus could feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge. Behind him, one of the women made a soft whimper of pain. It was barely audible, but in the desert silence, it might as well have been a scream. Garrett's head tilted slightly like a wolf catching a scent. "What was that?" "Wind," Thaddeus said quickly. "Loose board in the roof." But Garrett was already moving, drawing his weapon with practiced smoothness. "Boys, I think our hermit friend's been keeping secrets. Why don't we have us a proper look inside?" The other 5 men dismounted in unison, their movements coordinated and efficient. These weren't random thugs. They were professionals who'd done this many times before. Thaddeus realized with cold certainty that talking his way out was no longer an option. As Garrett stepped onto the porch, his boots creaking against the weathered wood, he spoke in a voice that promised violence. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to step aside, and we're going to collect our property. Anyone who interferes gets buried in the desert where nobody'll ever find them. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel." But as Garrett reached for the cabin door, Thaddeus made a choice that would change everything. The choice that had been building since the moment he'd seen 6 desperate women kneeling in his yard. Thaddeus raised his rifle in one smooth motion, the barrel coming to rest inches from Garrett's chest. The marshal froze, his hand still reaching for the door handle, his eyes widening with surprise and calculation. "I said this is private property," Thaddeus repeated, his voice deadly calm. "And I meant it. For a heartbeat." The world held its breath. 6 guns were suddenly trained on Thaddeus from the yard below, but his rifle never wavered from Garrett's heart. The marshal's face cycled through emotions: surprise, anger, and finally a cold respect. "You're making a mistake, friend," Garrett said softly. "A big one. Those women belong to us, bought and paid for. You're interfering with legal commerce." "Legal?" Thaddeus's laugh was bitter as alkali dust. "Slavery's been illegal for years, Marshal, even out here in the territories." Garrett's smile returned, thin and predatory. "These ain't slaves, Hermit. They're indentured servants, signed contracts and everything. They owe debts that need paying, and we're here to collect." Inside the cabin, Thaddeus heard Clara's voice, weak but fierce. "Lies. We never signed nothing. He drugged us, took us from a church social in Kansas." Garrett's face darkened at being overheard. "Sounds like you got some stolen property in there, friend. Property that's causing you to make poor choices." The standoff stretched like a wire pulled too tight. Thaddeus knew the mathematics of his situation. 7 armed men against 1 with 6 wounded women caught in the crossfire. Even if he killed Garrett, the others would cut him down before he could work the rifle's lever. But sometimes mathematics didn't matter. Sometimes a man had to make a stand regardless of the odds. "Here's what's going to happen," Thaddeus said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "You're going to get back on your horses and ride away. You're going to forget you ever saw this place or these women, and you're going to find yourself a new line of work." Garrett's scarred lieutenant shifted in his saddle, his gun hand twitching. "Boss, just give the word. We can drop him and be done with it." But Garrett held up a hand, his eyes never leaving Thaddeus's face. Something had shifted in the marshal's expression. He was seeing something he hadn't expected, a man who'd already made peace with dying. "You know what I think?" Garrett said slowly. "I think you got history with situations like this. I think maybe you failed to help someone once before, and now you're trying to make up for it." The words hit like physical blows. Thaddeus felt his carefully buried memories clawing their way to the surface. Another woman. Another desperate plea for help. Another moment when he'd chosen safety over courage. And watched someone die for his cowardice. "Touched a nerve, did I?" Garrett pressed. "What was her name? Wife? Sister? Daughter? Someone you let down when it mattered?" Thaddeus's grip tightened on the rifle, but his aim never wavered. "Her name was Sarah. She was my wife, and I won't make the same mistake twice." Garrett nodded, as if something important had been confirmed. "Sarah. Pretty name. Bet she died screaming, knowing you were too much of a coward to save her." The rage that exploded in Thaddeus's chest nearly cost him everything. For a split second his finger tensed on the trigger, ready to end Wade Garrett's life regardless of consequences. But in that moment of white-hot fury, he heard something that changed everything. Clara's voice from inside the cabin, barely a whisper but carrying clearly in the desert air. "Thaddeus. That's his name. The man who killed your wife." The words hit Thaddeus like lightning striking twice in the same place. Wade Garrett. The name he'd spent 3 years trying to forget. The man who'd come to their homestead with promises of protection, who'd demanded Sarah as payment when Thaddeus couldn't meet his extortion fees. The man who'd laughed when Thaddeus begged for mercy, who'd taken Sarah anyway when he refused to fight. Garrett's eyes glittered with recognition and sick pleasure. Well, well, Thaddeus Bell, the coward of Willow Creek. I wondered what happened to you after you ran away like a whipped dog. The rifle trembled in Thaddeus's hands, but not from fear. 3 years of guilt and rage focused into a single point of blazing hatred. "You killed her." "I didn't kill her," Garrett said with mock innocence. "You did, by being too yellow to fight for her. She called your name when she died. Wondered where her brave husband had gone." Thaddeus felt something fundamental crack inside his chest. The careful walls he'd built around his grief. The rational explanations he'd constructed for his cowardice. The lies he'd told himself about having no choice. All of it crumbled at once. "But here's the beautiful part," Garrett continued, his voice dripping with malicious joy. "History's about to repeat itself. Except this time, instead of 1 woman, you got 6. And you're going to watch me take every single one of them. Just like before. Behind Thaddeus, Clara's voice grew stronger, fueled by desperate fury. "He's lying, Thaddeus. About your wife calling for you. Sarah Bell died fighting. I know because I was there. I was one of the women he took before her." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Thaddeus turned his head slightly, never taking his eyes completely off Garrett. "What?" "Sarah Bell," Clara continued, her voice gaining strength despite her wounds. "Blonde hair, blue eyes, scar on her left hand from a cooking accident. She fought like a wildcat when they took her. Broke one man's nose, nearly took another's eye. And when she died, she wasn't calling for you. She was cursing Garrett's name." Garrett's confident smile faltered for the first time. "Shut your mouth, woman." But Clara pressed on, her words carrying the weight of witnessed truth. "She told me about you, in the wagon, said you weren't a coward, said you'd promised to come for her, and she believed you would. She died believing you'd come." Thaddeus felt the world tilt on its axis. For 3 years he'd carried the weight of cowardice, the certainty that he'd failed the woman he loved. But if Clara was telling the truth— "I searched for weeks," he whispered, the words torn from his throat. "Followed every trail, checked every town, but you were already gone." Garrett recovered his composure, but something had changed in his posture. He was no longer playing with a broken man. He was facing someone dangerous. "Touching reunion, but it changes nothing. You still lost her, and you're about to lose again." The marshal's hand moved toward his gun, but Thaddeus was already squeezing the trigger. The rifle's roar split the desert silence like thunder, and Wade Garrett flew backward off the porch, his chest blossoming red. Chaos erupted in the ranch yard as Garrett hit the ground. His 5 men opened fire simultaneously, bullets splintering the porch railing and shattering windows. Thaddeus dove behind a water trough, working his rifle's lever with practiced speed. The man who'd spent 3 years running from violence had remembered how to fight, but the odds were impossible. 5 professional killers against 1 rancher, with 6 wounded women trapped in the crossfire. Thaddeus knew he had maybe 30 seconds before they overwhelmed his position. Then Clara appeared in the cabin doorway, clutching a shotgun she'd found inside. Blood stained her dress, but her hands were steady as she fired both barrels into the nearest rider. The man tumbled from his horse, screaming. "The root cellar!" she shouted over the gunfire. "There's more weapons down there." The other women emerged from the cabin like avenging angels, each carrying rifles or pistols from Thaddeus's hidden arsenal. They were wounded, exhausted, barely able to stand, but they'd found something worth fighting for. Their freedom, and the first man in years who'd been willing to die for it. The gunfight that followed was brief, but brutal. Caught between crossfire from the cabin and the porch, Garrett's remaining men broke and ran. 2 more fell before they reached their horses. The survivors rode hard for the horizon, leaving their dead behind. In the sudden silence that followed, Thaddeus found himself kneeling beside Wade Garrett's body. The man who'd haunted his nightmares for 3 years was finally dead, but the victory felt hollow. Sarah was still gone. The years of self-imposed exile couldn't be undone. Clara knelt beside him, her own wounds forgotten. "She'd be proud of you," she said quietly. "Sarah, she'd be proud you finally fought back." Thaddeus looked up at the 6 women who'd changed everything by refusing to accept defeat. Clara, bleeding but unbowed. The fever-sick girl who'd found strength she didn't know she had. 4 others whose names he didn't even know yet, but who'd stood with him when it mattered. "What will you do now?" he asked Clara. She smiled for the first time since he'd met her. "We talked about it while you were playing hero. There's a town 2 territories north that needs teachers. Good folks who won't ask too many questions about where we came from." "And you?" she asked. "Will you go back to hiding in this valley?" Thaddeus looked around at his ranch, the place that had been both sanctuary and prison for 3 years. The silence he'd treasured now felt empty rather than peaceful. The solitude that had once protected him now seemed like another kind of death. "No," he said, surprised by the certainty in his voice. "I think I've been alone long enough. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel." 6 months later, a 1-room schoolhouse in the territory of New Haven welcomed its newest teachers. 6 women who'd learned that freedom was worth any price. Their friend Thaddeus built the school with his own hands, crafting each desk and window frame with the same care he'd once used to build walls around his heart. Clara married him on a spring morning when the desert bloomed with wildflowers, and she wore Sarah's wedding ring with pride, knowing that some loves are strong enough to bless new beginnings. The fever-sick girl, whose name was Grace, grew strong and tall, becoming the finest teacher in 3 territories. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind was just right, Thaddeus could swear he heard Sarah's voice in the desert breeze, telling him she was proud of the man he'd finally chosen to become. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a revelation so powerful it will stay with you long after the last word is spoken. Click on the video now.